The guard at Versailles found King Louis XIV doing something no one had ever seen before. The Sun King was burning his own furniture. Not out of madness, but desperation. It was January 10th, 1709, and the temperature inside the world's most magnificent palace had dropped so low that wine was freezing in goblets held in people's hands. The fountains had become grotesque ice sculptures. Courtiers were dying in their beds, their bodies discovered frozen solid in silk sheets. Outside, wolves prowled the streets of Paris, driven mad by hunger, attacking anyone foolish enough to venture out. Trees were exploding like cannon shots as their sap froze and expanded. The Seine had turned into a highway of ice so thick that merchants were setting up shops on it. This wasn't just a cold winter. This was nature declaring war on civilization itself. The Great Frost of 1709 had begun, and before it ended, it would kill more Europeans than most wars, destroy the Swedish Empire, bring Louis XIV to his knees, and rewrite the map of Europe using corpses as ink. In Venice, the lagoon froze for the first time in recorded history. In London, the Thames became a carnival ground, as people held frost fairs on ice, thick enough to support elephants. But behind the novelty was horror. Bread froze so hard it broke teeth. Livestock died standing up in their stalls, and babies froze to death in their mothers' arms. This is the story of the 3 months when hell froze over, when Europe discovered that all its power, wealth, and civilization meant nothing, when the temperature dropped low enough, when nature showed humanity who really ruled the world. Chapter 1. The freeze begins. When hell froze over. The winter of 1708 had already been harsh, but what arrived on January 6th, 1709, the Feast of Epiphany, was something beyond human memory or comprehension. Across Europe, temperatures plummeted so rapidly that people later swore they could feel the air itself freezing around them. In Paris, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in less than 24 hours. The cold came like an invisible army, advancing from the Arctic, with a speed that caught everyone unprepared. Fishermen on the North Sea reported that the ocean began to freeze while they watched, ice racing across the water faster than a man could row. Birds fell from the sky mid-flight, their bodies shattering like glass when they hit the ground. Horses dropped dead in their tracks, their hearts simply stopping from the shock of the cold. This wasn't a gradual cooling. It was as if God had suddenly decided to turn Europe into an ice sculpture. The scientific explanation, understood only centuries later, involved a perfect storm of climatic disasters. The Monde Minimum, a period of drastically reduced solar activity, had already cooled the Earth. Massive volcanic eruptions in 1707 and 1708 had filled the atmosphere with ash, blocking sunlight. The Gulf Stream, Europe's great heat pump, had weakened. Arctic air masses that normally stayed locked in the north broke free and poured south with nothing to stop them. But to the people of 1709, this was clearly either God's wrath or the devil's work. Priests proclaimed it punishment for sin. Scientists, what few existed, frantically consulted their instruments and found readings they couldn't believe. The thermometers of the day, primitive as they were, showed temperatures that seemed impossible. In some places, mercury itself froze solid. The human impact was immediate and catastrophic. In the first week alone, thousands died in their sleep, never waking from their frozen beds. The cold was so intense that it killed through clothing, through blankets, through walls. People would sit down to rest and be found hours later, frozen in position like statues. Children playing outside turned blue and died before they could walk the few yards back to their homes. The elderly dropped like flies, their bodies simply couldn't generate enough heat to survive. But most horrifying were the deaths of the healthy and strong. Young men who went out to chop wood were found frozen standing up, axes still in their hands. Women at market stalls died mid-conversation, their last words literally frozen on their lips. In the countryside, the situation was even worse. Peasants living in flimsy cottages had no chance against cold that could freeze stone. Entire villages were found days later with every inhabitant dead, preserved like some horrible museum exhibit. Livestock died in astronomical numbers. Cows, horses, sheep, pigs. Millions of animals perished in the first weeks. They died so fast that there was no time to butcher them for meat. Farmers would go to their barns in the morning to find every animal dead, standing in their stalls like frozen sculptures. The carcasses couldn't even be moved. They were frozen to the ground. Birds fell from their roosts. Fish died in ponds that froze solid from top to bottom. Even the rats in the walls died, their bodies discovered months later when the thaw finally came. The wealthy fared little better than the poor. At Versailles, the palace that symbolised the absolute power of Louis XIV, the cold made a mockery of royal privilege. The grand fountains, pride of the Sun King, froze into bizarre ice formations that would have been beautiful if they weren't so terrifying. The Hall of Mirrors became a death trap as moisture froze on the polished floor, sending courtiers sliding into walls. Bedchambers with their massive fireplaces couldn't stay warm. The cold simply overwhelmed any heat source. Nobles slept in their furs, their wigs, their court dress, and still woke, if they woke, with frostbitten extremities. The wine cellars containing vintages worth more than peasants would see in a lifetime became solid blocks of ice. When servants tried to extract bottles, they shattered like grenades, sending frozen wine shrapnel everywhere. The infrastructure of civilization began to collapse within days. Water sources froze solid, not just rivers and wells, but water inside pumps, inside pipes, inside homes. The Thames in London froze so thick that historians later calculated it could have supported the weight of a modern battle tank. The Rhine, one of Europe's great commercial arteries, became an ice road. The Baltic Sea froze solid enough that armies could march from Denmark to Sweden. In Amsterdam, the canals that were the city's lifeblood became death traps, as ice expanded and crushed boats like toys. Mills couldn't turn because their mechanisms froze. Forges couldn't stay hot enough to work metal. The very tools of civilization became useless. Communication broke down as roads became impassable, and messengers froze to death. Regions were cut off from each other, each thinking they alone were suffering this catastrophe. Letters from the period, when they finally arrived weeks or months late, told of isolation and terror. A priest in rural France wrote, "We thought we were the only ones left alive in a frozen world. No word came from anywhere. We burned the church pews for warmth and prayed that somewhere, someone else survived." The psychological impact was devastating. People who had lived through wars, plagues, and famines had never experienced anything like this. The cold was an enemy that couldn't be fought, couldn't be reasoned with, couldn't be escaped. Food supplies, already strained by years of war, became critical within the first month. Bread froze so hard it couldn't be cut with axes. Milk froze in cows' udders. Beer and wine turned solid in their barrels, expanding and bursting the wood. Even when food existed, it often couldn't be prepared. Fires wouldn't stay hot enough to cook, and anything cooked froze solid before it could be eaten. People resorted to eating anything that could be chewed: leather, bark, paste made from ground bones. Cannibalism, that last taboo, began to appear in isolated communities. A magistrate in Germany reported finding a family who had survived by eating their elderly grandmother, keeping her body in the snow outside and cutting off pieces as needed. The veneer of civilization proved terrifyingly thin. The religious response was immediate and intense. This had to be divine punishment. But for what? Every sect, every denomination had its theory. Catholics blamed Protestant heresy. Protestants blamed Catholic idolatry. Everyone blamed the Jews because medieval prejudices died hard. Flagellants appeared in the streets, whipping themselves bloody to appease God's wrath, their blood freezing before it hit the ground. Prayer services were held around the clock, but people died during Mass freezing in their pews. One priest in Bavaria reported giving last rites to a congregation where half were already dead but frozen upright. creating a macabre scene of the living, preying among corpses they couldn't distinguish from the merely cold. By the end of January, Europe knew this was no ordinary winter. This was something unprecedented in recorded history. A cold so intense, it threatened the very survival of European civilization. Kings and peasants alike huddled around whatever warmth they could find, equal in their misery. The old social orders meant nothing when the temperature dropped low enough. Noble blood froze just as fast as common. Wealth couldn't buy warmth when there was none to be had. Power meant nothing to the cold. As February approached, bringing traditionally the coldest part of winter, Europeans faced a terrifying question. If January had been this bad, what horrors would February bring? They were about to find out that nature's assault on humanity had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Social Fabric Tears. Civilization in the Deep Freeze. As February 1709 dawned with no relief from the Arctic conditions, European society began to unravel in ways that would have been unthinkable just months before. The cold had become a great leveller, but not in any romantic sense. It was stripping away centuries of social development and revealing the brutal calculations of survival. In Paris, the Comte de Saint-Simon recorded in his meticulous diary, "We have become savages in silk clothing. Yesterday I saw the Duchesse de Berry fighting a servant over a piece of firewood. She won by biting his hand until he released it." The rules that had governed society for generations were freezing and shattering like everything else. The servant class, the invisible army that made aristocratic life possible, began dying at appalling rates. They were the ones sent out into the cold to fetch water, gather firewood, tend to what animals remained. They lived in unheated quarters, ate last and least. By February, great houses were operating with skeleton crews, as servants either died or simply disappeared into the night, taking their chances elsewhere. The Marquise de Maintenon wrote to her confessor, "We dress ourselves now, like peasants. There is no one left to help. Those who remain are too weak to work or too bold to obey." The elaborate rituals of court life became impossible. Who could manage a formal dinner when the cooks were dead and the food was frozen solid? In the cities, social order collapsed neighbourhood by neighbourhood. The night watch, those primitive police forces, stopped patrolling when too many failed to return from their rounds. Looters moved through the streets like wolves, breaking into homes where families had frozen to death, stripping bodies of clothing and searching for hidden food stores. But even crime became difficult in the extreme cold. Fingers too numb to pick locks, stolen goods too heavy to carry, when every step was a struggle against freezing. A bizarre form of honour among thieves emerged in some places. In Amsterdam, gangs of looters began leaving the elderly and children alone, focusing only on houses where everyone was already dead. It was pragmatism disguised as mercy. The living might fight back, the dead couldn't. The medical profession, such as it was, faced impossible challenges. Doctors found that their traditional remedies were useless against cold. Bloodletting, the cure-all of the age, killed patients faster, as they couldn't afford to lose the warmth blood provided. Medicines froze solid in their bottles. Surgeons couldn't operate because their instruments froze to flesh on contact. Midwives reported that newborns were dying within minutes of birth, their tiny bodies unable to generate enough heat. One French physician, Dr. Jean-Baptiste Denis, documented attempting to save a pregnant woman whose labour had begun during the freeze. The infant emerged blue and still. Before I could wrap it, it had frozen solid. The mother, seeing this, simply closed her eyes and died. I believe she willed herself to death rather than live with the image. The economic system ground to a halt as surely as the frozen mill wheels. Markets couldn't function when vendors froze at their stalls and customers died carrying their purchases home. The credit system that underpinned commerce collapsed. What good were promissory notes when everyone expected to be dead before spring? Coins became worthless in many areas because there was nothing to buy. A wealthy merchant in Hamburg wrote, "I have gold enough to fill a room, and I would trade it all for a warm meal and the promise of surviving until tomorrow." barter returned, but with cruel twists. A loaf of bread might cost a gold ring. A bundle of firewood could buy a horse, if you could find either. The relationship between urban and rural areas, always tense, became openly hostile. Cities depended on the countryside for food, but rural areas hoarded what little they had. Armed expeditions ventured out from cities to forcibly requisition supplies, leading to battles in the snow between desperate populations. Peasants learned to hide their stores, burying grain in snowbanks, concealing livestock in hidden barns. When urban foraging parties arrived, they found empty villages. The inhabitants fled to the forests with whatever they could carry. These expeditions often ended in tragedy, with entire units of soldiers freezing to death on the return journey, their confiscated supplies scattered along roads that became lined with frozen corpses. The church, traditionally the provider of charity and comfort, found itself overwhelmed and failing. Monasteries and convents that had fed the poor for centuries now locked their doors, their own supplies running dangerously low. Priests died giving last rites, freezing as they moved from house to house. Churches became morgues, with bodies stacked like cordwood in the nave because the ground was too frozen to dig graves. The faithful began to question a God who would allow such suffering. A Catholic bishop in Bavaria wrote to Rome, "My flock asks me why God has abandoned us. I have no answer. I fear they are right." Splinter religious movements emerged, preaching that the end times had come, that this was the beginning of a new ice age that would last until Judgment Day. Education, art, and culture, the flowers of civilization, withered in the frost. Universities closed as students and professors alike fled or froze. The University of Paris, one of Europe's oldest, recorded that of 400 students present in January, fewer than 50 remained by March. Libraries became fuel as desperate people burned books for warmth. Priceless manuscripts, accumulated over centuries, went up in smoke. The painter Antoine Watteau wrote that his paints had frozen solid and his canvases cracked like ice. Musicians found their instruments unplayable. Strings snapped in the cold, wind instruments froze to lips, organ pipes split. The cultural life that defined European civilization simply stopped. Marriage and family structures buckled under the pressure. Young couples delayed weddings. Who could think of the future when survival to next week was uncertain? Existing marriages strained as couples fought over resources, warmth, food. Domestic violence increased as stress and desperation drove people to extremes. Children were sometimes abandoned by parents who couldn't feed them, left at church doors, or simply put out into the snow. Other families grew closer, huddling together for warmth and comfort. A diary from a Dutch merchant records, "We sleep now all in one bed, myself, my wife, our 3 children, her mother, and the 2 servants who remain. Propriety is forgotten, warmth is all." The treatment of the dead revealed how quickly civilization's rituals could break down. Traditional funeral practices became impossible. Bodies couldn't be washed, the water would freeze. Graves couldn't be dug and ground, frozen harder than stone. Coffins became luxury items as wood was needed for fuel. In many places, bodies were simply stacked outside towns, waiting for a thaw that seemed like it might never come. Wolves and dogs fed on the corpses, losing their fear of humans. In some regions, mass pyres were attempted, but the cold was so intense that bodies wouldn't burn properly. The half-charred remains created hellish scenes that survivors would never forget. By late February, a new social order was emerging from the ice, one based purely on survival rather than birth, wealth, or position. Leaders emerged not from traditional aristocracy, but from those who could organise warmth, find food, maintain hope. In some communities, blacksmiths became more important than nobles because they could keep forges running. Woodcutters gained status equal to merchants. Women who knew traditional preservation techniques were valued more than those who could embroider. It was a complete inversion of the social pyramid, enforced by the brutal democracy of cold. The psychological toll was mounting daily. Suicide rates soared as people chose quick death over slow freezing. Madness became common. The mind simply couldn't process the endless cold, the constant death, the breakdown of everything familiar. Whole families were found dead in poses suggesting they had simply given up, lying down together to die rather than continue fighting. Children stopped playing, their games forgotten in the struggle to survive. Laughter became so rare that when it occurred, it seemed mad. A French nobleman wrote, "We have forgotten how to smile. Our faces are frozen in expressions of endurance or despair. We are becoming something less than human." As February ended and March began with no sign of warming, Europe faced a terrifying reality. This wasn't just a harsh winter anymore. This might be the new normal. Scholars began to speculate that the Earth itself was dying, that the sun was going out, that this was how the world would end, not in fire but in ice. The social fabric hadn't just torn, it had shredded completely. What emerged from the tatters was a harsh new reality where survival justified anything, where civilization was a luxury no one could afford, where the only law was the thermometer. And still, the cold continued, relentless and merciless, as if winter had decided to stay forever. Chapter 3. The Empire Falls. Sweden's frozen catastrophe. While Western Europe struggled for survival in cities and villages, the Great Frost of 1709 was about to claim its most dramatic military victim on the frozen steppes of Ukraine. King Charles XII of Sweden, the Lion of the North, commanded one of Europe's most formidable armies, 40,000 battle-hardened veterans who had spent 8 years crushing every enemy they faced. They had defeated Denmark, humiliated Poland, and terrorised Russia. But as they pursued Peter the Great's forces deeper into the Ukrainian winter, they encountered an enemy no amount of courage or discipline could defeat: the coldest winter in 5 centuries. The Swedish army had been on campaign since 1700, living off the land, supplied by victory and plunder. Charles XII, only 27 years old, but already considered one of history's great military geniuses, had developed a system of warfare based on speed aggression and living off conquered territory. This had worked brilliantly in the rich lands of Poland and Saxony. But Ukraine in the winter of 1709 was a different world entirely. As the temperature plummeted below -30 degrees Celsius, -22 degrees Fahrenheit, the very tactics that had made the Swedish army invincible became their doom. You can't live off the land when the land itself is dead, frozen under feet of snow and ice. The first signs of catastrophe came in early January as the army marched toward the Russian fortress of Poltava. Soldiers began dropping on the march, not from enemy action, but from cold. The Swedish army's blue and yellow uniforms designed for northern European campaigns were woefully inadequate for the Arctic conditions they now faced. Men wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: stolen furs, blankets, even the hides of dead horses. But nothing was enough. Frostbite became epidemic. The army's surgeons, following the medical practices of the day, amputated frozen limbs with saws and axes. The screams of men having their feet cut off without anaesthesia echoed across the frozen steppes. By mid-January, the army was leaving a trail of severed hands and feet, black with frostbite, marking their route like grotesque breadcrumbs. The horses died by the thousands. Cavalry, the pride of the Swedish military machine, became useless as mounts dropped dead or were eaten by starving soldiers. The famous Swedish cavalry charge, which had terrorised European battlefields for a decade, was reduced to frozen men stumbling through snowdrifts. Artillery became immovable as horses died and gun carriages froze to the ground. Gunpowder wouldn't ignite properly in the extreme cold. Muskets misfired or exploded as metal contracted and expanded. The technological superiority that had given Sweden its edge evaporated in temperatures that turned sophisticated weapons into useless chunks of frozen metal. Charles XII himself seemed immune to the suffering of his men, driven by an almost inhuman determination to defeat Peter the Great. Witnesses described him sleeping in the snow without a tent, sharing the hardships of his soldiers, never complaining about the cold that was killing his army by the hundreds each day. This legendary toughness, which had inspired his men through 8 years of campaigning, now seemed like madness. His generals begged him to seek winter quarters, to save what remained of the army. Charles refused. He was convinced that Peter's forces were suffering equally, that one more push would bring victory. He couldn't have been more wrong. The Russians, under Peter the Great's strategic genius, had adapted to the winter in ways the Swedes couldn't. They had shorter supply lines, better winter clothing, and most importantly, they understood how to use the cold as a weapon. Russian forces shadowed the Swedish army, but rarely engaged directly. Instead, they destroyed everything that might provide shelter or food. Wells were poisoned or filled with snow. Villages were burned before the Swedes arrived. Any structure that might provide warmth was reduced to ashes. The Russians called it scorched earth, but in the winter of 1709, it was more like frozen hell. The Swedish army found itself marching through a landscape that might have been the surface of another planet, lifeless, hostile, and utterly without mercy. The suffering of the common Swedish soldier defied description. Letters found on frozen corpses and translated centuries later tell of horrors that seemed almost medieval. Men gnawed on leather straps and boot soles. They mixed gunpowder with snow and tried to eat it. Horseblood was consumed before it could freeze. When the horses were gone, there were darker rumours. Units that had been 100 strong in December were down to 20 or 30 men by February. Some companies simply disappeared entirely, every man dead, their bodies covered by snow until spring would reveal neat rows of blue and yellow corpses. Disease followed cold like a faithful servant. Typhus, spread by the lice that thrived in unwashed clothes, killed men already weakened by cold and hunger. Dysentery turned the army's camps into frozen latrines. Men who stopped to relieve themselves often froze to death with their trousers down, found later in positions that would have been comical if they weren't so tragic. Pneumonia was so common, it was simply expected. The army's medical corps, advanced for its time, was overwhelmed. Surgeons worked with hands so numb they could barely hold instruments. Medicines froze solid. Bandages became rigid with ice and blood. The wounded envied the dead. The breakdown of military discipline, the foundation of Swedish success, began slowly but accelerated as conditions worsened. Elite units that had never retreated began to simply melt away as soldiers deserted, preferring to take their chances alone rather than continue the death march. Officers found their orders ignored. Men refused to stand guard, knowing it meant certain death. Punishments that might have worked in normal conditions, flogging, reduced rations, became meaningless when everyone was already dying. Some units maintained cohesion through shared suffering, officers and men equal in their misery. Others descended into every man for himself chaos. The Ukrainian population, caught between the Swedish invaders and Russian defenders, suffered perhaps worst of all. Swedish foraging parties, desperate for food and warmth, stripped villages bare. Peasants were tortured to reveal hidden food stores. Women and children were thrown out of their homes so soldiers could burn the buildings for temporary warmth. The Cossacks, initially Swedish allies under Ivan Mazepa, began to desert en masse as they realised Charles was leading them to frozen doom. Ukrainian folk songs from the period speak of the Winter of Three Armies, Swedish, Russian, and death itself, with death being by far the most successful commander. By March 1709, the Swedish army that reached the vicinity of Poltava was a shadow of its former self. Of the 40,000 men who had entered Ukraine, perhaps half remained alive, and many of those were walking wounded, frostbitten, sick, and demoralised. The elite Drabant Corps, Charles's personal guard, was reduced from 200 to fewer than 50 men. The artillery train had lost most of its guns, abandoned in snowdrifts or spiked when they couldn't be moved. The cavalry could mount perhaps 2,000 horses, and those were skeletal beasts barely able to walk, let alone charge. Yet Charles XII, in what historians still debate was either supreme confidence or complete delusion, decided to besiege Poltava. His reasoning was that the fortress contained supplies that could save his army, and that Peter wouldn't dare attack in such cold. Both calculations proved fatally wrong. The siege operations in the frozen ground were nightmarish. Men trying to dig trenches found earth harder than concrete. Pickaxes shattered, shovels bent. The ground had to be thawed with fires before it could be excavated, and the smoke revealed positions to Russian sharpshooters. Swedish soldiers died digging their own defensive positions, frozen in the very trenches meant to protect them. As spring finally began to hint at its arrival in late March, it brought no relief, only new forms of misery. The thaw turned the frozen ground into impassable mud, trenches filled with ice melt. Bodies that had been frozen for months began to decompose, creating a stench that survivors said haunted them for the rest of their lives. Disease, held somewhat in check by the cold, exploded through the weakened army. And worst of all, the spring revealed to Charles what his generals had tried to tell him all winter. His army was no longer capable of offensive operations. They were a dying force, holding on through habit and the fading hope of victory. The stage was set for the Battle of Poltava in June 1709, but in truth, the battle had already been lost in the frozen months of January, February, and March. The Great Frost had done what no enemy army had managed. It had broken the Swedish war machine. When Peter's forces finally attacked, they faced not the terror of Europe, but a collection of sick, exhausted men who had already been defeated by winter. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic. Swedish units that had never retreated ran at the first charge. Men who had survived the winter threw down their weapons rather than face another day of suffering. Charles XII, wounded and carried on a litter, could only watch as his empire died on a Ukrainian battlefield. The aftermath was total catastrophe. Of the Swedish army that had entered Ukraine, fewer than 5,000 men would eventually make it home to Sweden. The rest died in battle, froze in the winter, succumbed to disease, or spent the remainder of their lives in Russian captivity. The Swedish Empire, which had dominated Northern Europe for a century, never recovered. The Great Northern War would drag on officially until 1721, but it had really ended in the frozen winter of 1709. Russia emerged as the new power in the region, with Peter the Great building his new capital of St. Petersburg as a monument to victory over both Sweden and nature. Charles XII escaped to Turkey, where he spent years in exile, plotting impossible returns to glory. He never understood or accepted that his greatest enemy hadn't been Russian guns but thermometers. His letters from exile still spoke of tactical errors, missed opportunities, if only this or that had been different. But his generals knew the truth. No amount of military genius could have overcome the Great Frost of 1709. Nature had passed judgment on Swedish ambitions, and the sentence was death by freezing. Chapter 4. France freezes, the Sun King's darkest winter. If the Great Frost destroyed Swedish military ambitions on the battlefield, it brought France, Europe's richest and most powerful nation, to its knees through a different kind of catastrophe. Louis XIV, the Sun King, who had ruled for 66 years and made France the envy of Europe, found himself presiding over a kingdom that was literally freezing to death. The magnificent Palace of Versailles, symbol of absolute monarchy and French glory, became a frozen tomb where courtiers died in gilded rooms and the king himself struggled to survive. The frost struck France with particular vengeance, as if nature wanted to humble the nation that claimed cultural superiority over all Europe. The Seine froze solid from Paris to its mouth at Le Havre. The Rhône, the Loire, even parts of the Mediterranean coastline turned to ice. In Marseille, a city that prided itself on mild winters, the harbour froze for the first time in recorded history. Ships were crushed like toys as ice expanded. The French Navy, Louis XIV's pride, and the key to challenging English maritime supremacy, found itself trapped and useless. Admiral Tourville reported to the Naval Ministry, "We have become a fleet of ice sculptures. I have 10,000 sailors with nothing to do but try not to freeze to death." At Versailles, the catastrophe unfolded with a mixture of grandeur and grotesque suffering that epitomised the contradictions of absolute monarchy. The palace's famous water features, the glory of Le Notre's gardens, became monuments to the frost's power. The Grand Canal froze so solid that courtiers initially treated it as entertainment, holding skating parties and sleigh races. But the novelty quickly wore off as the cold penetrated the palace itself. The Hall of Mirrors, where Louis had humiliated foreign ambassadors and celebrated his victories, became uninhabitable. Moisture from breath froze on the mirrors, creating a ghostly effect. Courtiers slipped on icy floors, breaking bones that couldn't heal properly in the cold. Inside the royal apartments, scenes unfolded that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Louis XIV, who had spent his reign creating elaborate court rituals to emphasise his divine status, now huddled around a fireplace with his closest courtiers like any common peasant. The king's legendary lever and coucher ceremonies, the rising and retiring rituals, attended by hundreds, were abandoned. No one could stand still long enough for ceremony. The Duc de Saint-Simon, whose memoirs provide our best window into court life, wrote, "His Majesty shivers constantly. He wears 3 fur coats at once and still complains of cold. The divine monarchy has become all too mortal." The suffering of the servants who maintained Versailles was appalling. They died by the dozens daily, freezing in the unheated corridors and servant quarters. Kitchen staff collapsed at their stoves. Stable boys were found frozen to death, still holding their pitchforks. The elaborate machinery of court life ground to a halt, as there simply weren't enough living servants to maintain it. Nobles who had never dressed themselves now struggled with buttons using frostbitten fingers. The Duchesse de Bourgogne, the king's beloved granddaughter-in-law, was found trying to make her own fire, weeping with frustration as her soft hands failed at the unfamiliar task. Throughout France, the agricultural catastrophe was total and unprecedented. The winter wheat, planted the previous autumn, froze in the ground. Fruit trees, some centuries old, exploded as their sap froze. The famous vineyards of Bordeaux, Champagne, and Burgundy were devastated. Vines that had survived since Roman times died in a single night. Wine merchants reported finding their cellars turned into caverns of ice, with bottles exploded and precious vintages reduced to frozen slush. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. Wine exports were France's second largest source of foreign revenue after textiles. But it was the death of the winter wheat that spelled true catastrophe. France's population of 20 million depended on bread as their primary food source. When farmers dug through the snow in late February to check their fields, they found nothing but black, rotted stems. The crop was completely destroyed. Panic spread faster than the frost itself. In Paris, bread prices rose 100% in a week, then 200%, then became meaningless as bakeries simply had no flour. The government tried to maintain order by promising grain from royal reserves, but those reserves had been depleted by years of war. Louis XIV's constant military adventures had finally come home to roost in the most brutal way possible. The Sun King himself became a tragic figure, watching his realm collapse around him while powerless to stop it. At 71 years old, Louis had outlived his son and grandson, leaving his great-grandson, a sickly child, as heir. Now he faced the possibility that there might be no kingdom left to inherit. His famous statement, "L'État, c'est moi," "I am the state," took on new meaning as both king and state shivered together. He ordered the royal furniture burned for warmth, shocking courtiers who had never seen him show weakness. He ate the same thin gruel as common soldiers. Most remarkably, he opened the royal gardens to the poor, allowing them to cut down centuries-old trees for firewood. In Paris, social order collapsed with terrifying speed. The Parisian mob, always volatile, became desperate and dangerous. Bakeries were looted and burned when found empty. The houses of suspected grain hoarders were attacked. The Comte de Toulouse barely escaped with his life when a crowd discovered he had a private store of wheat. The Parliament of Paris, usually subservient to royal will, began issuing emergency decrees without consulting Versailles. The Lieutenant General of Police d'Argenson wrote in his reports, "Paris has become ungovernable. I have 3,000 men to control 500,000 desperate souls. Mathematics alone dictates our failure." The church, traditionally the provider of relief in times of crisis, found itself overwhelmed and compromised. Monasteries that had fed the poor for centuries now locked their gates, their own supplies running dangerously low. The Archbishop of Paris issued pastoral letters calling for patience and prayer, but hungry crowds responded by attacking church properties. Several priests were killed trying to protect church grain stores. The crisis of faith was as severe as the physical suffering. If God had abandoned France, why should France maintain its devotion to God? Voltaire, then a young writer, penned satirical verses about priests growing fat while children starved, beginning his lifelong anti-clericalism. The medical crisis paralleled the food shortage. Hospitals, already overwhelmed by war wounded, couldn't cope with the influx of cold and starvation victims. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, the oldest hospital in the city, recorded admitting 100 people daily, most dying within hours. Doctors had no treatment for severe frostbite except amputation, and many patients chose death over life as a limbless beggar. The famous physician Fagan, first doctor to the king, admitted in a letter to colleagues, "We are no better than medieval barbers. We can diagnose death but not prevent it." Rural France suffered differently, but no less severely. Peasants had some advantages. They were closer to fuel sources and more accustomed to hardship. But they also lacked the stone walls and multiple fireplaces of the wealthy. Entire villages disappeared under snowdrifts that reached the rooftops. When spring finally came, search parties found communities where every soul had perished, preserved in their homes like insects in amber. The village of Montlhéry, south of Paris, lost every one of its 300 inhabitants. They were discovered sitting around their dead fires, having burned every piece of furniture, every tool handle, every wooden crucifix before succumbing to the inevitable. The relationship between city and countryside, always tense in France, became openly hostile. Armed expeditions from Paris and other cities ventured into rural areas to requisition grain, leading to pitched battles between urban foragers and peasant defenders. The Jacquerie, those peasant uprisings that had periodically convulsed France, took on a new character. Not political rebellion, but desperate defence of survival resources. Near Orleans, a battalion of royal troops sent to collect taxes was found frozen to death, apparently ambushed and stripped of their winter clothes by locals who vanished back into the forests. The economic collapse was total and would have consequences lasting decades. The Comte de Boulainvilliers, an early economic theorist, calculated that France lost 1/3 of its productive capacity in just 3 months. Textile production ceased as looms froze, and workers died. The silk industry of Lyon, pride of French manufacturing, saw 10,000 workers perish. Mines flooded and froze, making them unworkable. The royal mints couldn't function. Metal became too brittle to strike coins. Trade ground to a halt as roads became impassable, and rivers turned from commercial highways into barriers of ice. In the midst of this catastrophe, human nature revealed both its worst and best aspects. There were accounts of extraordinary cruelty, parents abandoning children, neighbours murdering for a loaf of bread, the strong preying on the weak without mercy. But there were also remarkable stories of sacrifice and solidarity. The Sœurs de Charité, an order of nuns, continued their work among the poor until the last sister froze to death at her post. a group of students at the Sorbonne shared their meagre rations equally until all died together rather than let some survive at others' expense. The Marquis de Vauban, the great military engineer, spent his fortune buying grain to distribute free in his district and died of pneumonia contracted while personally delivering food to peasant families. Louis XIV's government, the most centralised and absolute in Europe, proved utterly incapable of managing the crisis. Orders from Versailles took weeks to reach provincial administrators, and by the time they arrived, conditions had changed so drastically that the instructions were useless. The intendants, royal administrators, who were the backbone of French governance, sent increasingly desperate reports that revealed the breakdown of state authority. From Normandy: I cannot execute His Majesty's orders. I have no living officials to carry them out. From Provence: the population refuses royal commands. They say the king has abandoned them to freeze, so they abandon their loyalty. The military, consuming vast resources even in peacetime, became both victim and predator. Soldiers in barracks died by the thousands, their officers powerless to help. The proud regiments that had terrorised Europe were reduced to skeletal forces of frostbitten invalids. Desertion became epidemic. Why die for a king who couldn't keep you warm? Military discipline collapsed as soldiers turned to banditry to survive. The Régiment de Champagne, stationed near Reims, simply dissolved one night as every man took what he could carry and vanished. Their colonel was found the next morning, frozen at his desk, having stayed at his post out of a sense of honour that his men no longer shared. The intellectual and cultural life that had made France the envy of Europe came to an abrupt halt. The salons where philosophes debated and précieux held court fell silent. The Comédie Française closed its doors. No one could sit still long enough to watch a play. Writers couldn't write with frozen fingers. Painters found their oils turned solid. Musicians discovered that cold instruments produced notes that seemed to mock human suffering. Racine's last winter was spent burning his manuscripts for warmth, reportedly joking that at least his tragedies were finally providing some benefit. As February turned to March with no relief, a sense of apocalyptic doom pervaded France. Prophets appeared in the streets of Paris declaring the end times. A woman called Marie de Vallée gained a following by claiming the frost was God's punishment for Louis XIV's persecution of the Huguenots. Nostradamus was quoted endlessly, his vague prophecies twisted to fit current events. Even at court, superstition replaced reason. The Duchesse de Berry was caught performing what she claimed were ancient warming rituals, burning herbs, and chanting in languages no one recognised. The demographic impact was staggering. When census takers finally attempted to quantify the disaster in 1710, they estimated that France had lost between 600,000 and 800,000 people, more than most wars of the era. But the indirect deaths from subsequent famine and disease may have doubled that number. Entire bloodlines ended. Villages that had existed since Charlemagne's time were never repopulated. The generational trauma would echo for decades. Survivors spoke of l'année du grand hiver, with the same hushed tones their grandparents had used for the Black Death. By late March, as the first hints of thaw appeared, France was a different nation than it had been 4 months earlier. The absolute monarchy that had seemed eternal was revealed as fragile, dependent on the consent of the governed, consent that could freeze as surely as water. Louis XIV, who had spent his reign claiming divine right, now faced a populace that had seen God abandon them in their hour of greatest need. The social contract hadn't just been strained, it had shattered like ice. The seeds of revolution, though they wouldn't bloom for another 80 years, were planted in the frozen soil of 1709. When Parisians stormed the Bastille in 1789, some were old enough to remember their grandparents' stories of the winter when the Sun King couldn't keep his people warm, when bread disappeared, when the powerful proved powerless against nature's fury. The Great Frost had shown that even the mightiest throne could be toppled by something as simple as temperature. Act 3, Chapter 5. The Thaw of Death. When spring brought no relief. The first week of April 1709 brought what should have been salvation. Temperatures finally began to rise above freezing. Church bells rang across Europe as people celebrated the end of their frozen nightmare. But the thaw would prove almost as deadly as the freeze itself. As the ice melted, it revealed horrors that had been mercifully hidden by snow, created new catastrophes from flooding, and unleashed diseases that would kill hundreds of thousands more. The Great Frost's final act was perhaps its cruelest. It made people believe they had survived, only to strike them down with different weapons. The immediate visual impact of the thaw was apocalyptic. As snow melted from city streets, it revealed thousands of corpses that had been buried by blizzards. In London, the Bishop of Winchester wrote, "We thought we knew how many had died. We were wrong by a factor of 10. Every melting drift reveals new horrors. Bodies in doorways, in alleys, on the very steps of churches where they sought sanctuary." The corpses were in various states of preservation, some perfectly maintained by the cold, others partially eaten by desperate animals, or, in the darkest cases, showing signs of human interference. Children who had been missing since January were found mere yards from their homes, having gotten lost in whiteout conditions, and frozen to death within sight of safety. The disposal of bodies became an immediate crisis. The ground, still frozen several feet down, couldn't be dug for proper graves. The traditional solution, mass pyres, was complicated by wood being too wet to burn properly after months of snow. In many places, authorities resorted to dumping bodies in rivers, creating horrific floating morgues. The Thames carried so many corpses out to sea that fishing in the estuary was banned for fear of what might be caught in nets. The psychological impact on survivors, forced to see the full scale of death as it floated past, was devastating. Many who had maintained their sanity through the winter broke down completely when confronted with the thaw's revelations. But corpses were just the beginning of the thaw's horrors. The real killer was water. Water everywhere. Too much water. The wrong kind of water. As ice dams broke on rivers across Europe, catastrophic flooding followed. The Rhine burst its banks with violence not seen since Roman times, sweeping away entire villages that had survived the frost only to drown in April. The Danube became a raging torrent, carrying ice chunks the size of houses, smashing bridges that had stood for centuries. In Venice, the thaw of the frozen lagoon combined with spring tides to create the worst acqua alta in history. The Doge's palace flooded to the second floor. St. Mark's Square became a lake for 2 months. The city's famous Byzantine horses had to be evacuated by boat. The flooding wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly on multiple levels. Weakened by months of cold and starvation, people had no strength to flee rising waters. Entire families drowned in their beds, too weak to climb to safety. The floods contaminated every water source they touched, spreading human and animal waste through wells and springs. Diseases that had been held in check by cold exploded with virulence. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery raced through populations with no resistance left. A French physician in Lyon reported, "We survived the frost only to die of flux. The hospitals fill faster now than they did in winter. At least freezing was clean. This is filth and agony." The agricultural catastrophe became apparent as fields emerged from snow. The winter wheat was dead, as expected, but the soil itself seemed cursed. The freeze had penetrated so deep that it had disrupted the very structure of the earth. Fields that had been fertile were now waterlogged swamps or hardpan where nothing would grow. Desperate farmers tried to plant spring crops, but seeds rotted in the sodden ground. Those that germinated were weak, susceptible to every pest and disease. The locusts came in May, billions of them, as if nature had decided that Europe hadn't suffered enough. They devoured what little green appeared, leaving fields as bare as they had been under snow. The death of draft animals during the frost created a cascade of agricultural failures. Without oxen to pull ploughs, farmers tried to till by hand, breaking their weakened bodies on soil that resisted every effort. Without horses for transport, what little food existed couldn't reach markets. The elaborate networks of trade and distribution that had fed Europe's cities simply didn't exist anymore. A merchant in Hamburg wrote, "We have grain in our warehouses but no way to move it. We have money but nothing to buy. We have survived winter to face a spring that mocks our survival." The social and political upheavals that had begun during the frost accelerated during the thaw. Peasant uprisings, suppressed by winter's lethargy, exploded with the warmth. In France, the Camisard Rebellion reignited as Protestant peasants declared the frost had been God's judgment on Catholic persecution. In Germany, the Peasants' League reformed, demanding abolition of feudal obligations from lords who had failed to protect them. In Poland, serfs simply walked away from estates, declaring that the social contract had frozen to death. The traditional response, military suppression, was impossible with armies that barely existed. Many soldiers joined the rebellions they were sent to suppress. Urban riots became a daily occurrence across Europe. In London, the Bread or Blood riots of May 1709 saw 10,000 people storm the Guildhall. In Paris, crowds attacked the Louvre itself, dispersed only when the Royal Guard fired into the mob, killing hundreds. In Amsterdam, the traditionally stable merchant republic saw running battles between starving workers and the civic guard. But these weren't organised revolutions, they were spasms of desperation from people who had nothing left to lose. A British diplomat reported from Vienna, "There is no ideology here, no programme for change. There is only hunger and rage, endless hunger and volcanic rage." The economic systems that had frozen during winter showed no signs of thawing with the weather. Credit remained dead. Who would loan money when borrower and lender might be dead before payment came due? The great banking houses of Europe, the Fuggers and Medicis, found their carefully constructed financial networks as useless as ice sculptures in spring. International trade, dependent on predictable seasons and stable currencies, ground to a halt. The very concept of future planning became impossible when no one knew if there would be a future. Investment stopped. Innovation ceased. Europe's economy didn't just contract, it collapsed into subsistence mode, where only immediate survival mattered. The intellectual and cultural responses to the thaw revealed a continental crisis of faith. The Enlightenment, that great project of applying reason to human affairs, seemed to mock survivors who had seen civilization stripped away by something as simple as cold. Voltaire wrote, "We spoke of conquering nature through science. Nature laughed and froze our philosophers in their studies. The church, which might have provided comfort, was too compromised by its own failures during the crisis. Priests who had hoarded food while parishioners starved found empty churches. The Protestant emphasis on divine providence seemed cruel when applied to mass death. New religious movements sprouted like mushrooms after rain, most preaching that the last days had begun. The psychological trauma manifested in ways that would be recognised today as mass PTSD. Survivors couldn't sleep, haunted by memories of family members freezing to death. Any drop in temperature sent people into panic. The sound of wind triggered flashbacks to blizzards. Children who had lived through the winter played games that horrified adults. Freezing statues where they would lie still until someone thawed them, or hunger feast where they pretended to eat imaginary food. The birth rate plummeted, not just from physical weakness, but from a widespread belief that bringing children into such a world was cruel. Medical understanding of the crisis evolved slowly and painfully. Doctors who had been helpless during the freeze tried to make sense of the epidemics that followed. The connection between contaminated water and disease was observed but not understood in modern terms. Quarantine measures were attempted, but proved impossible with populations that needed to move to find food. Traditional remedies, bleeding, purging, mercury, weakened patients further. Some physicians began to advocate radical ideas like clean water and adequate nutrition, but these were precisely what didn't exist. The medical establishment's failure during both freeze and thaw contributed to a growing skepticism of authority that would characterise the coming century. The natural world itself seemed transformed by the Great Frost. Species of birds that had been common disappeared entirely, frozen in their migrations. Wolves driven from their normal territories became a plague across Europe, attacking humans with unprecedented boldness. They had lost their fear during the winter when human corpses became their primary food source. Wolf packs besieged villages like armies, requiring military interventions. In some regions, the wolf population explosion of 1709 to 1710 wouldn't be controlled for decades. Bears emerged from hibernation to find their habitats destroyed and became dangerous refugees in human settlements. By June 1709, it was clear that Europe hadn't survived the Great Frost, it had been transformed by it. The physical landscape bore scars that would last generations. Empty villages dotted the countryside like missing teeth. Cities had vacant neighbourhoods that wouldn't be repopulated for decades. Entire forests had died, creating dead zones that increased erosion and flooding. But the deeper changes were social and psychological. The optimism that had characterised the early Enlightenment was gone, replaced by a grim awareness of humanity's vulnerability. The belief in progress, in the perfectibility of human society, had frozen to death along with hundreds of thousands of people. The thaw of 1709 wasn't a return to normalcy, it was the beginning of a new, harsher normal. Europe had learned that civilization was far more fragile than anyone had imagined, that a few degrees of temperature could unravel centuries of development. The survivors carried this knowledge like scars, passing it to children and grandchildren in stories that began in the year of the Great Frost. These stories would shape European consciousness for generations, a reminder that nature's power to destroy remained absolute regardless of human pretensions. The spring of 1709 brought no renewal, only a different flavour of death, teaching the final lesson of the Great Frost: survival itself could be its own form of suffering. By the autumn of 1709, as the last victims of the famine finally died and the epidemics began to burn themselves out, Europe faced a reckoning. The Great Frost hadn't just killed people and destroyed property, it had fundamentally altered the trajectory of European civilization. The continent that emerged from the ice was different in ways both obvious and subtle, changes that would echo through the centuries. Political boundaries had shifted, social hierarchies had crumbled and reformed, and most profoundly, the European mind itself had been transformed by the confrontation with nature's absolute power. The immediate political consequences were dramatic and lasting. Sweden's defeat at Poltava, made possible by the Frost's destruction of Charles XII's army, ended Swedish dominance in Northern Europe forever. Russia, under Peter the Great, emerged as a major European power, a position it would never relinquish. The geopolitical balance that had existed since the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 was shattered. The Great Northern War continued officially until 1721, but its outcome had been decided in the frozen fields of Ukraine. The Swedish Empire contracted to its core territories, never again to threaten its neighbours. The power vacuum was filled not just by Russia but by Prussia, which would use the chaos to begin its rise toward eventual German unification. France, despite avoiding complete collapse, was profoundly weakened. Louis XIV, who had spent his reign pursuing gloire through conquest, found his kingdom exhausted, depopulated, and bankrupt. The Sun King's final years were marked not by glory but by desperate attempts to avoid total defeat in the War of Spanish Succession. The Treaties of Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714, that ended the war saw France surrender many of its conquests. More significantly, the absolute monarchy that had seemed unshakable was now questioned. The Parlement regional courts that Louis had suppressed began reasserting themselves. The nobility, having seen royal impotence during the Frost, started reclaiming privileges. The seeds of limitation on royal power, planted in frozen soil, would bloom into revolution within a lifetime. England, protected by the Channel from the worst of the continental catastrophe, emerged as the clear winner from Europe's suffering. While the Thames froze and London suffered, the island nation's shorter supply lines and maritime resources allowed faster recovery. The Bank of England, established in 1694, proved more resilient than continental financial institutions. British merchants moved quickly to fill trade voids left by Dutch and French weakness. The Royal Navy, with its bases in warmer waters, maintained operations while continental fleets froze in port. By 1710, London was replacing Amsterdam as Europe's financial centre, a position it would hold for 2 centuries. The Great Frost accelerated Britain's rise to global dominance by weakening every continental rival simultaneously. The economic transformations went beyond simple power transfers. The catastrophic failure of traditional agriculture forced innovation. In the Netherlands, farmers began experimenting with crop rotation and new varieties of cold-resistant grains. The famous Norfolk four-course system in England was partly a response to the vulnerabilities exposed in 1709. The selective breeding of livestock, which would revolutionise European agriculture, began in earnest as farmers sought animals that could survive extreme conditions. The enclosure movement in Britain accelerated as landlords argued that consolidated farms could better withstand climate shocks than scattered peasant plots. These agricultural changes, born from desperation, would eventually enable the population growth that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Financial systems underwent radical transformation. The credit networks that had frozen along with everything else were rebuilt with new safeguards. Insurance, previously focused on maritime ventures, expanded to cover agricultural risks. The concept of government disaster relief, almost unknown before 1709, became accepted as states recognised that major catastrophes required collective response. Tax systems were reformed to create emergency reserves. The idea of the state as provider of last resort, antithetical to traditional monarchy, gained ground. When philosopher John Locke wrote about government's duty to preserve life, liberty, and property, the memory of 1709 gave his words concrete meaning that resonated across Europe. Social hierarchies, rigid for centuries, showed surprising fluidity after the thaw. The Frost had been brutally democratic. Noble blood froze as quickly as common. In many regions, traditional elites had been so weakened by population loss and economic collapse that new men rose to prominence. Merchants who had hoarded grain became wealthier than ancient noble families. Peasants who survived with their land intact found themselves relatively prosperous as labour shortages drove up wages. The strict sumptuary laws that had regulated dress and behaviour by class became unenforceable jokes. A French observer noted, "One cannot tell master from servant anymore. The Frost has made us all equal in our patches and poverty." The intellectual impact was perhaps most profound. The Enlightenment, which had begun with such confidence in human reason, was forced to confront nature's power to humble all human pretension. This didn't kill the Enlightenment, but redirected it. Instead of conquering nature, philosophers began speaking of understanding and adapting to it. The systematic study of weather patterns began in earnest. The Royal Society in London established regular temperature recordings. The Academy of Sciences in Paris started collecting agricultural data to predict and prevent famines. Science became less about abstract knowledge and more about practical survival. The Encyclopedia of Diderot and d'Alembert, begun in 1751, devoted extensive space to agricultural techniques and weather prediction, direct legacies of 1709. Religious thought underwent equally dramatic changes. The providential worldview that saw every event as God's direct intervention became harder to maintain when God's intervention had killed hundreds of thousands of believers. Deism, the belief in a creator who didn't actively intervene in creation, gained adherents among intellectuals, traumatized by divine silence during the freeze. Traditional churches lost authority, while new evangelical movements emphasizing personal salvation grew. The Moravians, Methodists, and other renewal movements found fertile ground among survivors seeking meaning in their suffering. The neat medieval synthesis of reason and faith, already strained, shattered completely in the aftermath of 1709. Cultural expressions reflected the trauma. The elaborate Baroque style, with its emphasis on grandeur and control, gave way to the more intimate Rococo, as if Europe had lost its taste for monuments after seeing them crack in the cold. Literature became more personal, more focused on individual experience than grand narratives. The novel, that new form exploring private consciousness, flourished in post-Frost Europe. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, 1719, with its themes of survival against hostile nature, resonated with readers who had their own memories of isolation and desperation. Music evolved from the mathematical perfection of Bach toward the emotional expressiveness of the early classical period, seeking to capture feelings that pure reason couldn't express. The demographic recovery took decades and followed uneven patterns. Some regions never recovered their pre-frost populations. Others experienced rapid growth as survivors had large families to replace the dead. The genetic bottlenecks created by the massive die-off had lasting consequences. Certain family lines ended completely, taking with them unique genetic variations. Other traits, carried by lucky survivors, became more common. Modern genetic studies of European populations can still detect the echo of 1709 in unusual distributions of certain markers. The frost had conducted a vast, cruel experiment in human selection. Urban planning changed in response to the catastrophe. Cities rebuilt with wider streets to prevent the trap-like conditions that had killed so many. Public granaries became standard features. Building codes mandated better insulation and heating. The idea of cities as defensive fortifications gave way to concepts of cities as survival systems that needed to function in extreme conditions. Amsterdam pioneered public works programs to employ the destitute, recognizing that social stability required preventing the desperation that had led to riots. These reforms, adopted across Europe, represented early forms of the welfare state, born not from ideology, but from the memory of frozen corpses in the streets. The scientific revolution accelerated as researchers sought to understand and predict weather catastrophes. The thermometer, barometer, and other instruments were refined and standardized. International cooperation in weather observation began, with stations across Europe sharing data. The search for patterns in climate led to early theories about solar activity, ocean currents, and atmospheric circulation. While full understanding wouldn't come for centuries, the systematic study of climate began in direct response to 1709. The Royal Observatory in Greenwich, originally focused on navigation, added weather prediction to its mission. These efforts, primitive by modern standards, represented humanity's first organised attempt to defend against climate catastrophe through knowledge rather than prayer. Military thinking evolved to account for weather as a strategic factor. The destruction of the Swedish army proved that no amount of training or equipment could overcome extreme cold. Military manuals began including sections on winter warfare. Supply lines were reorganised to account for possible weather disruptions. The concept of seasonal campaigns, already practiced, became absolute doctrine. Armies developed specialised winter equipment and tactics. The lessons learned in 1709 would be applied and relearned in every subsequent winter campaign, from Napoleon in Russia to Hitler at Stalingrad. The Great Frost had taught that General Winter was an enemy more implacable than any human opponent. The memory of 1709 created a cultural trauma that manifested in folklore, superstition, and collective behaviour for generations. Grandparents terrified children with stories of the Great Frost. Communities maintained emergency supplies even in prosperous times. The first sign of an early winter sparked panic buying that could empty markets. Weather prediction became an obsession, with every village having its expert who claimed to read signs in everything from cat behaviour to cloud formations. Most of these were nonsense, but the psychological need for early warning was real and lasting. Annual ceremonies commemorating survival became common, mixing Thanksgiving with warnings to stay prepared. As the 18th century progressed, the Great Frost of 1709 became both history and myth. The facts were terrible enough, but embellishment added demons in the blizzards, ice giants walking across frozen seas, and divine visions in the aurora borealis that had indeed been unusually visible that winter. These stories served important functions. They kept the memory alive, transmitted survival knowledge, and provided narrative structure for incomprehensible suffering. The folklore of 1709 joined the Black Death and the 30 Years' War in the European catalogue of catastrophes that shaped collective identity. By 1750, Europe had largely recovered in material terms. Populations had rebounded, cities were rebuilt, and trade flourished. But the psychological scars remained. The optimism of the early Enlightenment had been tempered by awareness of vulnerability. The belief in inevitable progress was balanced by knowledge that progress could be erased by something as simple as temperature. This more complex, nuanced worldview would characterise the mature Enlightenment. Voltaire's Candide, with its mockery of optimism in the face of catastrophe, couldn't have been written without the memory of 1709. The Great Frost had taught Europe that civilization was not an achievement but a constant struggle against forces that remained utterly indifferent to human suffering. The scientific and social changes initiated by the Great Frost would culminate in the modern world's approach to natural disasters: systematic preparation, international cooperation, government intervention, and technological solutions. Every weather satellite, every famine relief program, every building code for extreme conditions carries DNA from 1709. The Great Frost forced humanity to acknowledge that nature retained absolute veto power over civilization's pretensions. That acknowledgement, painful and costly, may have been the Great Frost's most lasting legacy. The understanding that survival requires not conquering nature, but respecting and adapting to its power. The guard at Versailles found King Louis XIV doing something no one had ever seen before. The Sun King was burning his own furniture. Not out of madness, but desperation. It was January 10th, 1709, and the temperature inside the world's most magnificent palace had dropped so low that wine was freezing in goblets held in people's hands. The fountains had become grotesque ice sculptures. Courtiers were dying in their beds, their bodies discovered frozen solid in silk sheets. Outside, wolves prowled the streets of Paris, driven mad by hunger, attacking anyone foolish enough to venture out. Trees were exploding like cannon shots as their sap froze and expanded. The Seine had turned into a highway of ice so thick that merchants were setting up shops on it. This wasn't just a cold winter. This was nature declaring war on civilization itself. The Great Frost of 1709 had begun, and before it ended, it would kill more Europeans than most wars, destroy the Swedish Empire, bring Louis XIV to his knees, and rewrite the map of Europe using corpses as ink. In Venice, the lagoon froze for the first time in recorded history. In London, the Thames became a carnival ground, as people held frost fairs on ice, thick enough to support elephants. But behind the novelty was horror. Bread froze so hard it broke teeth. Livestock died standing up in their stalls, and babies froze to death in their mothers' arms. This is the story of the 3 months when hell froze over, when Europe discovered that all its power, wealth, and civilization meant nothing, when the temperature dropped low enough, when nature showed humanity who really ruled the world,